Thank you. Before I start talking, I just want to say a little bit about the structure. I have a lot of music to play because I think it's a lot more important to hear the music than to hear me talk. And I know that we're supposed to be out of here at 7, so unless you have an absolutely burning question that cannot wait, if you could wait until the end to ask questions, that would be helpful. If, on the other hand, there's one that you're afraid you're going to forget or is just earth-shatteringly important, by all means, put your hands up. He was born into a cultured family where his talent was realized very early. He also had an equally talented sister, and unlike him, her compositional ability was not encouraged by her family. By the time he was 11, he'd written works for orchestra as well as operas. He wrote many great works before he was 20, and a number of works that we still perform regularly before his premature death in his middle 30s. Mozart? Maybe, but I'm actually talking about Felix Mendelssohn. If Mozart and Mendelssohn had both died at 20, it would be kind of a toss-up as to which one was the greater composer, although I think the nod still would have gone to Mozart. But when you think about the overture to A Midsummer Night's Dream, and particularly works like his great octet for strings, Mendelssohn before 20 was a formidable composer. It's after the age of 20 that Mozart really runs away with the competition. This is going to be the Reader's Digest version. Less than an hour and a half is nowhere near enough time to even begin to do justice to such a great composer as Mozart. I just spent 10 weeks of hour-and-a-half classes talking about Mozart, and I still just scratched the surface. So please forgive me if I leave out all of your favorite works of his. A little bit of historical background. Art seems to fluctuate between the desire for clarity and the desire for emotional outpouring. And this goes back to the ancient Greeks, Plato versus Aristotle. And it's certainly something that we see if we look at one of the watershed years of Western musical history, 1600. Up until that point, counterpoint was king. By counterpoint, I mean, in particular, imitation, where a line has a nuclear melody and then another group comes in singing that, and then a third group, kind of like an elaborate version, very elaborate, of Row, Row, Row Your Boat. By the end of the 16th century, composers such as William Byrd, Thomas Tallis, Giovanni Palestrina had written fantastic works, mainly vocal and choral, that used elaborate counterpoint. Along comes 1600, and philosophers, and particularly people in the church, were saying, you can't understand the words. Give us a single melody. And so what we now think of as the Baroque era was born. And originally the Baroque era borrowed some things from its predecessors, but also emphasized a single melody. Well, by the end of the Baroque era, and let's use Bach's death as an example, 1750, the music had become elaborate and contrapuntal once again. And so the pendulum swung back. And we have the new style, what we now call the classical style, but in its day it was called the style galant, the gallant style. And it was championed by, of all people, two of Bach's sons, Johann Christian and Carl Philipp Emanuel, and also probably the inventor of just about everything we know about classical music, Franz Joseph Haydn. The center was a little town in Germany called Mannheim, where a number of composers formed an orchestra which performed this new music, which emphasized a single line with chordal accompaniment. And I want to play you two examples to show you the difference between the eras. The first example, written around 1720, is Bach's wonderful D minor concerto for 2 violins. And I'm going to play you about a minute's worth. You're going to get really frustrated with me by the end. I'm playing little bits. But you can always listen to the whole piece. Now watch. Second violin comes in with the same thing. So you'll notice, kind of like a little chase. The voices come in, they chase each other around. Wonderful music, but too elaborate for people around 1750. In fact, by Bach's death, he was looked on as rather old-fashioned, which is something that we would certainly dispute today. In Mannheim, they even developed a way of opening a symphony or some other work that came to be known as the Mannheim Rocket. It's because it took off, and it usually did an arpeggio. That is, if you're doing a C major chord, C, E, G, C, it is impossible to count the number of symphonies of that era that begin like that. I'm actually going to play you 2 Mannheim Rockets today, but unlike most of the music of that era, they're both in minor rather than major. The first one I'm going to play is actually in reverse. This is the rocket coming back down to earth. And this is from around 1800. It's the beginning of Franz Joseph Haydn's fantastic Mass, what we now call the Nielsen Mass. And just listen to how it opens. It's one of my favorite pieces of all time. It pained me to stop there. Notice the difference in style. It's very clear. For one thing, the chorus and the orchestra come in unison. Haydn is such a skilled composer that he can alternate between places where everybody's playing the same tune and places where he's using harmony. You seldom hear that in music from the Baroque era. It doesn't mean you never hear it, but this is such a very different style. And this is the world into which Mozart was born. It was a very exciting era because not only was there a new style, a new way of writing, but there were all these new forms. The symphony, the string quartet, the piano sonata, the piano trio, piano quartet, string quintet, serenades for winds. All these things, solo concerto in a very different style from the Baroque concerto, new forms, the rondo form, sonata allegro form, theme and variations. So there were all these new toys to play with for composers. And Mozart was like a sponge. He did have instruction from his father, but there's a story that when he was 5 and his father was playing something, little Mozart actually corrected him. I'm not sure I would have wanted my children to do that, but that's another story. His first work, and we go by the Kirchel listing, which was done in the 19th century, so it is no longer completely accurate, but this piece, at least we know, he wrote when he was 6 years old. It's K1, his minuet, and it was probably written either for harpsichord, probably harpsichord. He started using the forte piano later, which is kind of like the modern piano. It's a lot closer than the harpsichord, but it's still not the same as the instrument that, for instance, Chopin and Liszt were writing for. So here is Köchel 1, and what I want you to notice is not only how lovely the little melody is and how well it works, but how already at age 6 he's experimenting with form. Minuet, as you know, is in 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. But there are places in this where he goes, instead of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, he goes 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. So he changes where the stresses are. 6 years old, folks. Back to the beginning. And that was the great 20th century German pianist Walter Klein. And you'll notice the form was kind of like an ABA. It was called a minuet and trio, and in the trio, the music goes into a new key, and then it returns to the beginning, but without the repeats that were in the first section. The Mozart family was very peripatetic. Papa was very ambitious for his son, and so he dragged the whole family all over Europe, which in those days meant riding on terrible rutted roads, in unsprung carriages, getting stuck in the mud, suffering from potential illness. In fact, Mozart got smallpox and almost died when he was about 10 on one of these trips. By the time he was 14, he'd already been to England, to Paris, to Munich, to Vienna. Remember that the family was centered in Salzburg, Austria, and to Italy 3 times. And as I said before, he was like a sponge, so he soaked up all of this style and ideas from different composers that he met, and he charmed a lot of them, including Johann Christian Bach in London, where as a little boy he sat on Bach's lap, and the two of them traded phrases on the harpsichord, and listeners could not tell who was playing which. It was so smooth. As he got to be a teenager, he began to chafe a little bit at his father making all of his decisions for him. And this tension was to increase throughout the rest of his short life, to the point where his father refused to give permission for Mozart's marriage until he grudgingly accepted the inevitable and sent the permission that arrived the day after Wolfgang and Constanze were actually married. There were a lot of things. It was a complicated relationship. Mozart adored his father. His father definitely loved him, but his father certainly had control issues, as we would say today. One of the popular forms of the day was the serenade. It was a form of outdoor entertainment that was adaptable for any number of instrumental groups. A lot of times they were done for wind instruments because they tended to make more sound outside. And I am using two versions of the same piece to illustrate something, and that is that Mozart was so skilled that a piece that you would swear could not work for any other combination of instruments than the one that he originally wrote it for, in fact, he was able to make work just as well. So this is the opening of his Serenade in C minor, Köchel 388, that he wrote in probably when he was around 20. And I'm just going to play the beginning. And do note, please, the Mannheim rocket at the opening in unison going upward, but in minor. Now you'll notice, this is an octet, okay? 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 horns, 2 bassoons. He adapted it sometime later for string quintet. And if you go to the Taconic concert on Saturday evening, you will actually hear, you'll get to hear all of it. We're just going to listen to the first movement. But notice how skillfully he has translated this piece from 8 winds to 5 strings. You'll also notice how far he has come in a few years in terms of the profundity of his music. I've often thought that you could not write really profound music for winds as you could for, say, string quartet. Well, I have revised that opinion because of what Mozart wrote in his wind serenades. That piece has wonderful themes and a great deal of depth. When he writes in minor, which is not that often, but when he writes in minor, a lot of his deepest feelings come out. And we think of Mozart as this sunny bird always singing, and he does. But there is a strain of deep melancholy in his writing that comes out in his works, particularly his works in minor. And so now let's listen to the first movement of this for string quintet. time through the exposition. This is in sonata allegro form. It's like a huge A-A-B-A. The development is the B. That will come soon. This is now the development, where he takes the ideas from the exposition and plays with them. This is the recapitulation where we go back to the beginning, but with some changes. talking about opera in a few minutes, but if you think of Mozart as he thought of himself, which is as primarily an opera composer, that is a very operatic movement. It has dramatic shifts in character and in dynamics, places where the players are all playing together and other places where they seem to be having a dialogue with one another. And if you think about all of those wonderful ensemble sections in Marriage of Figaro or Don Giovanni or the other operas, you can see that Mozart used those same approaches to purely instrumental music. Now, like Bach before him and Beethoven after him, he was a skilled string player, although apparently when he was about 6 or something, before he'd had any training at all, his father and a couple of friends were going to sit down and play a string quartet, and Mozart just picked up another violin and sat down and played the second violin part, even though he hadn't received any training yet, which is pretty disgusting. But anyway. And so when he played quartets, and remember, that was a way of people having a good time together. They made their own music. And when he played in quartets, like Bach and Beethoven, his preferred instrument in the quartet was the viola. He learned all the way through his life. And if we start with his earliest symphonies and move forward, he was always incorporating new knowledge into what he was writing. Period in his early 30s was a very difficult one. The last couple of years of the 1780s was very difficult. He and his wife were in debt. A lot of his possibilities had dried up because of the Austrian-Turkish War. And it was really, it took its toll on him. His usual high volume of composing dropped. But one thing that was a great benefit to him and to us was that one of his very musical friends, Baron von Swieten, who was a huge fan of the music of Bach and Handel, asked Mozart to do some transcriptions and reorchestrations of some of the works of those two masters. And Mozart absorbed a lot of their approach to counterpoint. He did a reorchestration of Handel's Messiah, for instance. And when you listen to his last works from about 1785 onward, you'll hear a much greater emphasis on counterpoint. And there's no better example than the final movement of his final symphony, which incorporates a fugue, which is the ultimate in counterpoint, in 5 voices. So we're going to hear that final movement. This is the last symphony that he wrote.
Could we just increase the volume a little bit on your...
On me or on the music? Well, I've got it all the way up.
Okay, great, thank you.
The one we just listened to was a little bit low. Some of the other ones aren't nearly so low, so we'll just have to check. This is Loren Maazel leading the Sinfonia de Galicia. That was the end of the third movement, the minuet.
Do we need to be louder?
Hear the imitation in the voices? still pretty electrifying 230 years later. You know, it's really amazing how he prefigures Beethoven. He's got the main theme, this little motif, ba-dee-da-da, and he plays it off against, and sometimes you'll have 2 or 3 of each one of those going on at the same time at different times against 2 or 3 of the other one. And yet he manages always to bring it back together with and it all sounds so easy. As if he just fell out of bed in the morning and said, I think I'll write a 5-voice fugue and put it at the end of my 41st symphony. So it's really incredible how he developed his skill over the years. A lot of people think of Mozart as somebody who was almost like an idiot savant, somebody who just didn't know what he was doing and the melodies just came to him and he wrote them down, as if it was sort of in the saying, you know, direct from God's mind onto the paper. But Mozart worked very, very hard, especially at his melodies. He worked and he honed them. They were usually too complicated to begin with, and he honed them until they were the pristine creations that we all admire so much. And nowhere is that more evident than in his operas. As I said before, he considered himself primarily an opera composer. And by the time he was 12 or 14, he'd already written a half-dozen operas, some of which had been performed. He cut his teeth on Italian-style opera. There were 2 main styles of opera in the 1760s and 70s. There was Parisian opera and there was Italian opera. His was definitely Italian in nature. During his life, he wrote operas in Italian and he wrote operas in German. And what I've always said is, when he wrote operas in Italian, excuse me, he was an Italian composer. When he wrote operas in German, he was a German composer. And the 2 examples I have, I think, illustrate that really well. Italian opera was divided into 2 types, buffa and seria. Buffa often had spoken dialogue and a lot of comic mishaps, with a lot of very fast, almost patter-like melodies where the words are just spat out at supersonic speed. Opera seria was much more grave, often on a topic or a theme from antiquity. And Mozart wrote in both styles. And after the great success in Prague of The Marriage of Figaro, they asked him in Prague to write a new opera. And so right around the same time he was working on his symphonies, his last symphonies, 1787 or so, he began work on a new opera, and he asked his librettist, Lorenzo da Ponte, to work with the old Don Juan story. And Mozart was usually really good at getting what he wanted from his librettist, either by cajoling or bullying. And later, Da Ponte said that he, in fact, based the story on his own exploits as a Casanova. And apparently he was friends with Casanova, who was a real person. But this is different from some of the other Don Juan stories. This is the first one in which the opera actually opens with a rape. And that is a much darker version than in any of the other plays or operas that were written on this subject. And the thing that so troubled some of his contemporaries was the way in which Mozart combined sometimes side-splitting comedy with very dark moments. And I'm going to play you 2 to illustrate that. But before I do, I've read that Beethoven saw Don Giovanni and was absolutely shocked. Now, Beethoven had a sort of a puritanical side to him, but he vowed, in fact, he called his sister-in-law the Queen of the Night, but that's another story. He was apparently so troubled that he vowed that he would write an opera in which true love was rewarded, and thus came Fidelio. What we're going to pick up on is about midway through the first half of Don Giovanni, in which the Don is celebrating his various female conquests, and all sorts of people are coming to his manor, and he says to his servant Leporello, okay, this is great. Let's have a party. Let the wine flow. I'm going to add a number of conquests to my list. Leporello keeps a book, and in fact, there is a catalog aria in which he names off for Donna Elvira all of his conquests in Germany, in Italy, in France, and in España, 1003. 1003. So in this one, with Carlos Alvarez singing the Dawn, he says, okay, get everything ready. And this is a Buffa-style aria. It goes like the wind. I'm glad I don't have to sing that. That's a lot of words. As it turns out, things don't work quite so well in that party because the Avengers, Donna Anna, whose father, the Commendatore, Don Giovanni, has killed as he tries to protect her, and her fiancé, Don Ottavio, who's always impressed me as being sort of a wimp. He's the only tenor in there, and as a tenor, I'm kind of offended. But anyway, they come along with Donna Elvira, who is another former lover that the Don has spurned. And they make it so that he has to escape. But he does escape, and he thinks it's all great. And then all sorts of adventures happen. And at the end of some of those adventures, he's recounting what he has done to Leporello, and they happen to be in a graveyard when a voice calls out, "Don't be so loud, you are disturbing the dead." So they say, I wonder who this is, and it turns out to be coming from the statue of the Commendatore. And Don Giovanni, ever the flippant one, says, "Leporello, invite him to supper." And so Leporello says, "What are you, nuts?" And he says, "Go ahead, invite him to supper." And so he does. And the Commendatore accepts. So fast forward to a scene where, once again, the Don is having a banquet prepared, and there's some very funny moments in this where Leporello is trying to sneak food into his mouth, and the Don sees him and pretends he's not seeing him and asks him all sorts of questions that Leporello can't answer because his mouth is full. But then Donna Elvira comes running in and says, "I don't care what you did to me. I still care about you. I beg you, repent your life." She said, "Why should I do that?" And she said, "Please do this for your own sake, if not for mine." And he says, "Go away." She leaves, and you hear a scream. And so Don Giovanni says, "Leporello, go out and find out what that is." And he says, "I don't want it." He says, "Go." So he goes out, and he sees that it is the statue of the Commendatore at the door. So he comes running back in, and we come in on one of the absolutely most dramatic scenes in all of opera.
Turn it down.
Oh
second violins. Listen to this. He stays on the same note very soon, and the orchestra revolves around him. Right here. could take a long time talking about that. A trio of 3 basses, that's pretty revolutionary, number one. But the way he combines comedy, I mean, Leporello's lines are pretty doggone funny. Oh, no, 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 he can't come, he can't come. And also how the anti-hero at the end is heroic in his courage. Not until we see Carmen do we find another protagonist who shows the same courage in the face of what's probably certain death. Kill me or let me pass, she says. And he says, I will not be accused of cowardice. And as Monty Python would say, and now for something completely different. In 1790, Mozart collaborated with a Viennese impresario, playwright, theater owner, Emanuel Schikaneder, on a Singspiele, which is the German equivalent of an opera buffa. That is a story basically funny that has spoken dialogue and singing. In this case, there were kind of pastiches, different bits grabbed from mythology, ancient mythology, folk tales all over the place. And Mozart was one of the composers who wrote numbers for this opera. He then was asked by Schikaneder to write a complete opera. Schikaneder would provide the libretto. They were both members of the secret society, the Freemasons, which, although to us seemed to incorporate lots of what we would consider mumbo-jumbo in the sort of secret rites that they enjoyed, included a lot of the great lights of the Enlightenment, because their goal was to have an elevated life led by reason, which in the 18th century was in the ascendancy and influenced people as diverse as Mozart and Thomas Jefferson. So this story, The Magic Flute, which is putatively set in ancient Egypt, incorporates a lot of the symbolism of Freemasonry. Threes. We have 3 chords at the beginning. We have 3 women who are assistants to the Queen of the Night. We have 3 little boys who help to guide the main characters to safety. Lots and lots of threes. The basic story is about a prince who is escaping from a serpent, he faints and the serpent is killed by these 3 women who tell him that the daughter of their boss, the queen, has been stolen away by an evil sorcerer. And they give him a picture, and of course he's immediately smitten and sings a lovely aria about that. Meanwhile, this funny character shows up on stage, and we get the difference between the noble and elevated Tamino on his quest to rescue the fair princess Pamina, and everyman, Papageno. And this is the great British baritone Simon Keenlyside singing Papageno's first aria, The Birdcatcher Am I. Keep your fingers crossed. Stage directors love this opera because they can have so much fun with the costuming and all the other things that go on. At the other end of the spectrum is the Queen of the Night. And she is very angry because her late husband had given over the care of their daughter to Sarastro, thinking that he was better suited. And of course, in a lot of productions, we see her as somewhat unhinged, so maybe it wasn't such a bad idea, but to our modern eyes, it seems somewhat sexist. The only thing I'll say in defense of the opera is that when it comes time for the ultimate tests, Tamino and Pamina go through together and become joint heads of the temple. But in the meanwhile, the queen is trying to get the crown of the sun, which is the big symbol of the temple, and the only way to do it and to free her daughter is to have her daughter kill Sarastro. And so she's here talking to her, and I'm going to read you the translation of the aria because this particular one does not have English subtitles. Der Höhle Rache is the name of the aria. The vengeance of hell boils in my heart. Death and despair flame about me. If Sarastro does not through you feel the pain of death, she's talking to her daughter here, then you will be my daughter nevermore. Disowned may you be forever. Abandoned may you be forever. Destroyed be forever all the bonds of nature. If not through you, Sarastro becomes pale as death. Here, gods of revenge, hear a mother's oath. And what I'm going to play for you is a version in which Diana Damrau, who is, well, you're going to see for yourself, she is a real queen of the night. And by the way, it's important to have good singers in all roles, but I always judge a magic flute production by how good Papageno is and how good the Queen of the Night is. And I think you'll agree she's really something. And you don't really have to know what the English is in some of this to get that she's really upset.
Als ich ihn danach beredete, sprach er: Alle Schätze sind dein und deiner Tochter. Aber der siebenfache Sonnenkreis ist für Sarastro bestimmt. Er wird ihn so männlich verwalten wie ich bisher. Und du, Weib, forsche nicht nach Gründen, die dem weiblichen Geiste unbegreiflich sind. Deine Pflicht ist dich und deine Tochter der Führung weiser Männer anzuvertrauen.
So ist wohl auch Tamino. Auf immer für mich verloren.
Verloren. Wenn du nicht, ehe die Sonne die Erde färbt, ihn durch diese unterirdischen Gewölbe zu fliehen beredest, der erste Schimmer des Tages entscheidet, ob er ganz dir oder den Geweihten gegeben sei.
Dürfte ich den Jüngling, der das
She's pleading for Tamino because she loves him.
Mein Vater selbst war ja mit diesen weisen Männern verbunden. Er sprach jederzeit mit Entzücken von ihnen, preiste ihre Güte, ihren Verstand, ihre Güte, ihre Tugend. Sarastro ist nicht weniger tugendhaft.
Was höre ich?
What do I hear?
Meine Tochter! Könntest einen Mann lieben, der mit seinem Todfeinde verbunden ist? Siehst du diesen Stahl? Er ist für Sarastro geschliffen. Du wirst ihn töten und den mächtigen Sonnenkreis mir überliefern. Aber kein Wort! Guck in meinem Herzen!
about that for an exit, huh? But unfortunately for her, she does get her comeuppance. It's a great opera, and he wrote it and conducted the premiere less than 3 months before he died. The last work that Mozart wrote, he never completed. And despite all of the mythology surrounding the Requiem, much of which was put out by his widow afterwards, because she wanted it to sound as though he had written the whole thing, when in fact it was completed by one of his students. You know, there was supposed to be this mystery person who came to the door and said, "You will write a requiem, but I will not tell you for whom it is." It was an ambassador for Count von Wolsek, who was a nobleman who liked to pretend that he was a composer. And he often passed works off as his own after he'd commissioned them. Constanze needed the money after Mozart died, so she tried to pass it off as his. So she invented all this mythology around it. But in fact, Mozart knew exactly for whom he was writing. It's just he got too sick to complete it. We're going to hear just a bit of the opening. This is from a 2014 performance at the BBC Proms with Donald Runnicles, leading the BBC Scotland Orchestra and the National Youth Choir of Scotland, and 4 soloists. And just the opening always gives me chills. And the weird-looking clarinets are basset horns. They're an older relative, and he decided to use that sound in this piece. There are the basset horns right there. I'd love to play the whole thing for you, but I want to leave us at least a couple of minutes in case you've got some questions. I didn't leave a lot of time for that because I always like to try and get in as much music as I possibly can, but all of these performances are available on YouTube. You can find some magnificent performances. All you have to do is type in YouTube Mozart Requiem BBC 2014 and the whole thing will come up and you'll hear the magnificent diction of these teenagers. They're really phenomenal. So, do you have questions for me? Yes, ma'am.
Comment. I enjoyed watching your face. Watching this, I mean, the passion in you is so obvious.
Well, I like to think that as a composer, I appreciate the music in a slightly different way because I know what it takes to actually write the pieces. And I was once told when I was in college by one of my fellow students that I ought to practice piano facing the mirror. I did not take her up on that advice. Yes, sir.
Would you remind me the movie that Mozart's 23rd Piano Concerto made famous?
Elvira Madigan, that's the 21st Piano Concerto? Yes, K467 in C major. Dum da 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 dee da 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 da. Yep. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
When did he write his violin concertos?
It's interesting. He wrote all 5 of them when he was 19. He wrote them for himself as soloist, and after that, he basically stopped performing as a violinist. But he continued to perform as a pianist. Yes, sir.
What was the opera prior to Zauberflauto, the one that you played?
Don Giovanni.
Don Giovanni, yeah.
Yes.
Some of the music in the Requiem is very similar to some of the themes. Very similar to the music in Don Giovanni.
It is, and in fact, if you see all of this particular performance, Donald Runnicles talks about that at the beginning. The BBC always does these great introductions. And he says, in fact, that this is Mozart's greatest opera. Even though he didn't finish it. So yes, very, very operatic in his approach, even to purely instrumental music. So, yes?
And the trios between the Magic Flute and the Requiem are very similar.
Yes, the ensemble writing. I mean, he was the same composer. I mean, one of the things that people who were trying to appear clever said dismissively about Verdi's opera was, Verdi's Requiem was that it was opera dressed in sacred clothing. And, well, why not? I mean, Verdi was an operatic composer. It's a great work. And Hans von Bülow, you know, it was the Germans thinking the Italians couldn't write anything. But Brahms, who was a friend of von Bülow, said von Bülow's mistaken. This is a great work. So I think you have to look beyond that. Who cares whether it's an opera or not? It's great and very moving music. So yeah, really operatic. Yes, sir.
So play What If for a minute. What if he lived another 10 or 20 years?
I think that it would have been very interesting to see him and Beethoven in the same city at the same time. There are varied stories as to whether Beethoven actually played for him as a 17-year-old or whether he was called back because his mother was extremely ill. He was called back to Bonn and they didn't actually meet. But I think that would have been fascinating. I think they both would have learned from each other, and I think Haydn would have learned more from Mozart. Because he did learn a lot from Mozart, just as Mozart dedicated 6 string quartets to Haydn as an homage.
Well, what's the overlap? The Beethoven first and second symphonies are...
late 1790s. 1795, 1798, Mozart died in 1791. So by that time, Beethoven, maybe his first piano trio, but nothing that... he was making his name in Vienna. He didn't actually come back until after Mozart had died. And then he was making his name as a piano improviser, primarily, not as a composer of finished works. These guys were all prolific improvisers, and they took part in what was the 18th and early 19th century equivalent of jazz players' cutting contests, where they'd get up and they'd flash for each other, and then the audience would decide who won, and sometimes the audience would hand up a theme and they had to improvise on it. And it was all part of the trade. And both Mozart and Beethoven, and actually Muzio Clementi, whom we don't know very well, but he and Mozart were in a contest, the keyboard contest, and some people say that Clementi actually bested Mozart. So, other questions? Well, I want to thank you all for coming. I really had a good time.